Nice to have you, David. You're very, very welcome to Dublin. And it's great that you're here as part of this conference, which is Let's Talk About Assessment, Rethinking Assessment in Higher Education. So it's really valuable to have your expertise. And I think the conference is a lot about talking, so we just wanted to have a chat with you really about some of your views and your experience about assessment. So one of the things I think that people often start with is like why we assess. So I wonder, could you even start thinking about, just chatting about, like, what are the purposes of assessment?
I think that's a very good start, because we often think of assessment as one thing. You know, we're used to assessment as testing, of grading, of a whole range of things like that. But I think it's quite useful now to think of assessment as having three main purposes, fundamental purposes, and one of which is to assure that students have met the learning outcomes of a course, module, a program, whatever. So this is, have students reach the stage of having met some kind of standard that enables us to say, yes, we can certify you, we can stamp you and give you approval for that. So that's the assurance purpose.
It's a nice term, actually, assurance. Actually, it's an interesting term.
It's to assure the students, ensure us, but it's also to assure the community outside that this is a person graduating who can do some things, and we've assured that.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's the one purpose. Second purpose is really to help students through their pathway towards attaining those outcomes. So in order to reach a particular standard, then students will need to do various things, try things out, make mistakes, get helpful comments on their work, change what they do, in order that ultimately they can meet those standards, those requirements. So that's a formative process, and that involves feedback processes of one kind or another. Okay. So that's the second one. And the third purpose of assessment is to recognise that it isn't just about us assessing students. We need students to be able to make judgments of their own learning. And we need them to make judgments of their own learning for right now, because it helps them make judgments about whether they're ready to be assessed by us. We need that, they need to make judgments of their own learning, because in the workplace, that is the normal business. You know, normally you and your work group make judgments about, is this task being performed adequately? And it's too late sometimes if someone else comes down from above and finds out that it isn't meeting the standards. So that's an intrinsic thing you need to do, both for learning and for work. And that capability of developing one's evaluative judgment is a fundamental purpose of all our courses.
It's interesting, isn't it, in the language of it, a lot of people often don't see that as assessment. You know, when people talk about assessment, they often think of that first one that you talked about, don't they? They often don't think that judgment piece, that's not really assessment. Is that a challenge, do you think, and just even people's understanding of some of those purposes?
It is, and historically that's the one we've paid most attention to.
Yeah.
That's the one we put most effort into, we spend most money on. And in recent years, then the second of those purposes, the formative, the feedback, that's coming up in importance, because we realised students don't learn through being tested, they learn through learning first and then being tested. So we need to pay some attention on helping them through that pathway. And then even more recently, that third purpose of developing their evaluative judgment, we're starting to recognise the importance of that, partly because of pushback from the world outside. We don't just want students that know stuff. We want students that know stuff, and they know that. They can do things, and they know they can do things. So it's this awareness of one's own learning and one's own achievements, which is something we need to help students work towards. And they don't learn that through being told. They have to practice that as almost like as a skill.
It's a really important skill. I might bring you back to the first one, actually, because that's one people are very obsessed with, both students and staff, which is that assurance one. Sometimes we've called it in Ireland, I suppose, assessment of learning, but I think it's that graded piece that really challenges us. I suppose, what have you views around the grading process and criterion norm referenced? Have you I suppose expand on that a little bit, your kind of views around those? Yeah.
Well, most countries, including Ireland, including Australia and a whole lot of other places, have moved over the last 20 years or so from a system which wasn't terribly well articulated towards outcomes-based approaches. I prefer to call them standards-based, because we base assessment now on whether students meet a particular standard. And it doesn't matter whether lots of students can meet that standard or a few, the standard is consistent over time. So that's in contrast with norm-referenced assessment. So standards-based has a continuous standard that students are judged against. Norm-referenced judges students against the other students in their cohort. And this doesn't work anymore. I'm not sure it worked terribly well in the past, but it certainly doesn't work now, because if you change the cohort, you change the standard. So if you have norm-referenced assessment, you don't have no control over the standards that students meet. All they do is they can do it better than someone else in their group. And also we need to prepare students for thinking in terms of outcomes and standards, because they can meet criteria. They're in the dark, you know. Are we set in another situation in which they just beat other students in the same class? This doesn't lead to cooperation. This doesn't lead to collaboration. It involves a degree of competition which is probably more than is necessary for healthy learning.
And do you think there's a whole rhetoric sometimes around grade inflation and the damage of it, and we really need to move away from that rhetoric and move away from that? It's quite a societal and quite institutional change, isn't it?
It is. So in a norm-reference system, we have no control over grade inflation because there is no standard they need to meet. So a standards-based approach is a way of having some kind of yardstick, some benchmarks against which we judge students, and we shouldn't expect, that to change over time. Yeah. So we have a fixity that doesn't exist previously.
Okay, yeah. So it's fascinating, the grading, because it actually does come very much from the student's point of view. So do we think students? I suppose, what's students' role in this? Do we need to educate them more? Have they a kind of a role in this? Or
yes. Oh, there's one other thing I want to add on the first part, and that is, when we're talking about a standards-based situation, we need to ensure that all students meet that threshold, that minimum standard. Okay. And it's very important that we take that seriously. In the past, we've taken the grade boundaries at higher levels as the thing we spend most time discussing. Whereas now, we mustn't discuss pass marks because pass marks don't communicate very much. We need to ask ourselves, is or is not, do we know or do we not know whether a student is doing things which enable us to say, yes, they've met that threshold for that particular standard, for that particular learning outcome.
So to make sure I understand you, so we need to focus more energy on that threshold piece rather than the A's and B's and...
Yeah, I'm not saying we ignore the rest, but we direct our attention in a way that doesn't assure the quality of the whole system at the moment. And assurance of the whole system means that we need to be pretty confident that when a student has passed, he or she has passed, not because they did very, very well on some learning outcomes and very badly on others, and it's all averaged out. Yes. We need to say, if these are the things they've got to meet, they met the threshold on all of them. And that's a big shift.
And that is a difference, because we're used to getting means and averages and, and doing that kind of a statistics.
And you can do that within a given learning outcome over time with regard to this learning outcome a student has progressed. But we can't do it across learning outcomes because we're adding things together that can't be added. Yeah. And this is very disturbing for some people. And it means that, for example, increasingly when we report on students' performance, typically we had 1 grade per module. Yes. Now we need to think about 1 grade per learning outcome.
Per learning outcome. That's quite a shift, actually, in a way of thinking. Yes. Yeah. I might just move on a little bit then to I suppose, your second purpose that you mentioned, which is around the word feedback, which in itself is a challenging term. Could you elaborate a little bit around what we need to do in that space around feedback? Yeah.
I think we've conventionally thought about feedback as the comments that staff members make about students' work, whether it's written, verbal, or whatever mode it's in. And this is a rather strange idea because we're focusing on what teachers do rather than on what students do. And surely we're in the learning business, and that is we need to be more focused on what teachers do, what learners do, than what teachers do. So there's been a bit of a revolution in thinking about feedback in recent years. And it's basically moved away from the idea of focusing on the inputs that students receive from other people to the processes they engage in to utilise those inputs in order to improve their work. So feedback we now see as a learning-centred process, and it's a process, not just an input, in which students make sense of information they get from other people about their own work. Not generally, but about their own work. And they use that to improve their, what they do in the future, their tasks, their learning processes and so on. And it means we have to kind of complete this loop. So a feedback loop, which means if all we're doing is focusing on what the teacher does, this is sending information out into the ether. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the students pick it up, sometimes they even read it. And sometimes they act on the basis of it. So we need to be thinking of feedback as such that we've structured a process whereby the expectation on students is they utilise information, they do something with it. But that puts an obligation on us of designing feedback processes in that we need a place for the feedback to land. So the students have made sense of this information, it changes what they do, and they need to find some way of being able to show that they've learnt from that. Now, that might be in a subsequent task or a final assessment or whatever, but it means that we can attune our own inputs in the light of what actual effect they have on students, rather than on the basis of, well, these are useful comments I can make about this piece of work. I'm less concerned with the student uptake and utilisation of what I have to say.
It's quite a change again, actually, isn't it? It's a much more dynamic process, isn't it, really, the kind of the new changes in feedback. It seems nearly like a conversation in a way, isn't it? It's kind of...
Well, I mean, people use the term feedback dialogue. And what we're doing in this, when thinking about feedback processes, is that we're thinking of the process more as dialogic. Not that there is a kind of to and fro in backwards and forwards all the time. That's not realistic. But, for example, we need to find ways of involving students in the process. And one simple way of doing that, which takes a bit of practice on the part of students, is that when they produce a piece of work, we ask them, alongside, I'm handing this in, we ask them to identify what kind of comments, what kind of areas would you think it most useful to receive comments about?
To empower them a little bit in the process.
That's right. We're focusing their attention on what they need. So they're thinking about their own work, they're judging their own work a bit. But what it means is that when we provide comments to them, they're actually interested in them because they've asked for them. So if you think about feedback often, what we're doing is we're thrusting unsolicited comments on students, things they didn't ask for. And we're expecting them to be delighted and to run with it and change what they do. Now, if you or I received unsolicited comments in almost any situation, we would put the barriers up. We'd say, hang on, let's back off here. Whereas if we start with the student, what would you find helpful? It doesn't mean to say we don't say other things as well, but we're entering into a space that the students have defined. Now, when we first introduce this, we need to give them a bit of practice because they're bound to say, oh, well, you give me whatever you like. You're the teacher, you know these things. But we need to give them opportunities to identify the kind of things they can say. And once they've got the hang of it, then over time,
they get into it. It is quite a change for them because it's not something that they would see themselves, I suppose, historically and over time. They haven't been involved in that process, so it's quite a change.
Yeah, we kind of keep our fingers crossed, We provide it with information and we just say, well, hopefully something will happen. Right?
Yes.
But we don't actually set things up in such a way that really enables it to occur.
Actually, it leads very nicely in some ways, that idea of empowering students, getting them more involved, and in fact it's a much more efficient way for staff as well, much more better use of their time, that students are more involved as well. It leads nicely, I suppose, onto the third purpose, which I know you've done a lot of work on, David, is this idea of students being able to self-evaluate, monitor. I know it's called different things. Evaluative judgment is a term you've used. Maybe you could expand on that, because it leads nicely onto it about students' judgment, doesn't it? Yeah.
It's based upon this idea that it's not enough to be assessed by other people. We need, if we're going to be a competent person that operates well in society, or even an effective learner, we need to be able to make judgments about the quality of our own work, and indeed the quality of the work of other people. And we don't learn that by other people unilaterally assessing us all the time. So in order to learn that ability, we need to practice it. So we need to put students in situations in which they're making judgments about their work, judgments about the work of other people, and they refine that over time. So they're developing the capacity to make these evaluative judgments. Now, it happens that it's not domain independent, so that you can't just do it in one subject area and expect it to transfer to others.
Okay, that's interesting.
It's something that they need to practice over time. So.
And is it something then, I suppose, that they might build in over a curriculum? Would it be skills that maybe over a program that you could build? Yes.
So that it's not a matter of something you can do in one particular module.
Yeah.
You need to see that as something which develops over modules over time. So in the past, there have been all sorts of very good studies of self-assessment, peer assessment, and so on. But they really don't add up to very much, right? Students like them, people satisfied, but what do they add up to? So in order to do that over time, we need that practice. And we've done a study in which we show, even without any particular additional inputs, getting students to make judgments of their own work over time improves their judgments.
So actually it does seem that maybe one of the solutions to that is teams or program teams coming together to say maybe what might happen in the curriculum, because it's quite a elaborative skill in a way for a student to get to that point.
But this business of teams, I think, is much more important than just doing it for this purpose of assessment. That I think none of us should be working out our own assessment practices independently of our colleagues. We need to take the group of staff that are working on this particular part of the curriculum, whether it's students, staff in the first year, or taking one thread over time, and get together and collectively identify how we're going to assess, how we're going to assure. Are you going to do that in your unit, or am I going to do it in mine? So we make sure that all the bases are covered, so that when we put the whole lot together, we're not just having completely independent assessment practices, looking at different learning outcomes in different areas. We're actually doing something that adds up meaningfully, that builds towards students meeting the outcomes of the programme as a whole.
It's probably a good point to finish on, actually, isn't it? Because the programme approach to assessment is really quite key for institutions, and that it's a complexity, I think, in modern day modularisation, but much more efficient and much more.
It is, and one of the reasons why it's hard for us to think about programmatic assessment, that is across the programme, is that we have these habits, or we divvy up the different modules and then we all go and do our own thing. Now, we might talk to each other politely about these in examiners' meetings and things like that, but what you do in assessment is like, we don't want to infringe on your territory. We've actually got to break that down, because we can't do programmatic assessment if we're just all doing our own thing. We need meaningful ways of talking to each other, agreeing with each other, doing a bit of swapping of tasks over the different modules, in order that the whole thing adds up to be much more than the sum of the parts. At the moment, it might be a bit less. We want it to be more than the sum of the parts.
Actually, I think to finish, conversations and programs are really important for people to have conversations, and I think it leads nicely, I suppose, into the conference that's happening let's talk about assessments. So I think we'll leave it at that. More conversations is really...
Let's talk
Let's keep talking.
even more about assessment.
Even more about assessment. So David, thank you very much.
Thank you, Geraldine.
It's really nice talking to you, and thank you for your expertise and comments. Thank you.